Ryan, did you hear the one about the leader who brought a ladder to the meeting?
No.
He wanted to take things to the next level, but word to the wise, this is a cautionary tale. The higher up you go, the more your ass shows. Humor. Our episode today is sense of humor. Don't leave home without it. And I want to welcome everyone who's listening or watching the Entrusted podcast today. And our guest today is a sterling example of someone who uses humor to maximize effect. So let me tell you a little bit about Ryan. Ryan McCoy currently serves as Chief Advancement and External Partnerships Officer. Recently, he earned his doctoral degree from the University of Colorado, Denver. Ryan also served as the Executive Director of the Advancement and Development Office and Foundation for a community college. And in addition to his professional roles, Ryan has a deep history of service to his community. He served 2 terms on a school board, including 4 years as a board president. His dedication to advancing the lives of others is evident in his work fostering philanthropy and building impactful partnerships and creating world-class programs that empower communities to thrive. A proud alum of his school district, Ryan's passion for giving back runs deep. He is not only an employee and former board member of the same school district, but he was also a graduate there, reflecting his lifelong connection to the community. Ryan is committed to ensuring opportunities for all students, and he wants our listeners to know that he looks nothing like Chris Hemsworth. So, Ryan, do you have a joke for us?
Not at all. I'm not that funny. No, I will say my humor and what I bring to the table usually comes in the moment, the situation, what's transpiring, not a typical stand-up comedian as much as I love stand-up.
All right. Well, I know that all of our work as leaders is taxing.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's long hours.
Right.
I used to tell my team all the time, you can work half days, whatever 12 hours you want, because it seems like that's the way it goes in terms of leadership in our work. But I think humor, and the reason I chose this topic today for the podcast, is so incredibly important. We can't take ourselves too seriously.
No, because none of us are going to get out of this alive anyway. So
that's
might
exactly
as well have fun.
Right. We're all in the queue.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with just talking a little bit about benefits of humor in the workplace? What benefits do you see?
Well, I think it establishes culture as well. I think in the world of just education alone, our work is serious. It's impactful. But I also think that it allows us to be human with one another, and also to understand where other people's perspectives come from. So I think humor, very similar to how you would music, there's different varieties, different styles, different things, what people find funny. But I think the one thing as a leader when navigating your space and bringing humor to the table is also knowing your audience, because as you said, you know, the higher you go up the ladder, the more of your ass shows. Well, there are many times as a vulnerable leader, I am an ass myself, and I don't mean to.
So I think that humor does serve a lot of different purposes too. One I can think of is when things are really tense and maybe a meeting is very serious in nature, that kind of thing. How do you know how to read that room, or when situationally do you know it's time to lighten things up?
Well, I will say everything's about relationships, first of all. And so typically, you know all the players in the room, you know the stakeholders who are there. And so you know what their preferences are and their styles of humor when engaging with them. So you know when your coworker next to you is taking things a little bit too seriously. And it's being able to adapt to that situation and to employ certain levels of humor to ensure that we, one, refocus the group, but number two, it signals to that other individual that, okay, I need to tone it down, or that, yeah, it's not as serious as I'm making it out to be.
Or how about, in some instances, I've seen people actually latch on to that humor because it helped them save face from something that was
100%.
going on in a meeting where they weren't showing maybe their best side of things or their best self.
For sure. And I think even in the conversations where you are meeting with external partners, it also shows your corporate culture when you're dealing with someone who's outside of the organization, of how your team itself synergizes together and can have a good laugh to collectively, even if you're bantering with one another. It just shows that that this is a true team at play, because with the work we do, we spend so much time with each other that if we're not bringing an element of fun to it, then why are we there? But I will just say, when we're with that external partner, there's some richness that comes from that they recognize, and they're like, I want to be part of that organization. We're going to want to partner with this particular group because they're going to bring some excitement to the table as well.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, and I know you feel this way because we've had these conversations. I certainly feel this way. We spend more time with the people we work with a lot of times in our own families at home. And so we need to behave like a family with relationships, even at work, if we can build that culture.
100%.
Yeah. Comment about that in terms of the culture.
Well, I can give it a quick anecdote that transpired actually just this week, where I spilt a giant glass of red wine on my superintendent's dress, which she was wearing a white dress. And at that moment, everyone's face went completely pale, looked over at me, and the superintendent just goes, her face, and of course in shock, stands up and is drenched in this red wine and just looks at me, and she's like, "Well, you just ruined that dress." And I just looked back at her and I said, "Well, I was trying to tell you something about the dress." And so, but that moment, because everyone in the where we were at, and we were at a conference, looked over because there was a lot of commotion, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And, we both shrugged it off, laughed about it, and continue to laugh about it. And that'll be part of our history together as we grow into the next phases of our work in our school district. But that story will never go anywhere because it's being brought up repeatedly, and it's only been 3 days.
It's only been 3 days. And of course, she probably, just knowing her, would say something like, "And after that, Ryan was cut off."
That's right.
I'm guessing.
Right. Well, but we were at, unfortunately, we were at the beginning of the night. So,
well, there you go. Yeah, I think you brought up something that I think is really important with leadership, and you have to be able to laugh at yourself.
100%.
Is there different types of humor? Self-deprecating humor is one of those, and so there are different types of humor. And I know we're trying to balance the workplace with, having a few laughs too. Correct. At the same time. But what do you think the different types of humor are?
Well, for me personally, we were raised with a specific quote in our family, and it's, "No person is completely worthless. They could always serve as a horrible example." And I use that quote in all aspects of my life, but especially when, as a leader, we have to show vulnerability. And so self-deprecation, I like to make fun of myself, Pam, but in doing that also, it shows that I'm human to the people I'm interacting with. But I think there's a lot of other styles of what people prefer. I would also say I'm very much a smart ass when at the table, but I do love dry humor.
I never would have guessed that.
I do love dry humor, though. So when people, that joke that no one else laughs at, those sometimes are my favorite jokes. And it's not the dad joke, because those aren't funny in general, but the Steve Martins of the world, where it's just like, "Ooh, that's clever. That's clever." I love that type of humor. And people who can deliver that and deliver it timely there's just a uniqueness to them and in their ability to do that.
Yeah, it's almost deadpan, isn't it? It just comes out of left field and hits you with it. So,
and I do love banter. So to me, that's a love language. So if you can come at me and, jab me personally in something and have a joke behind that, to me, that's you showing appreciation of me, that we're at that level of relationship where we could jab at each other and still walk away and still be friends after the day.
Yeah. And I think the relationship is key there. Right. So
100%.
Reading the room, I think situational humor, if you have a room full of people you've never met before, that's a whole different animal.
Right.
Than people, their preferences and how far to jab them, really. Right.
Well, context completely matters in that situation as well.
Yeah.
We've all been in a room where there's inside jokes and someone says something and you're like, "What did I miss?" And then there's those moments of some people who are really sensitive to that and would be thinking that they're part of the butt of the joke, even though they're not. It was just an inside joke between between two individuals. Those are always awkward moments, but I'm also a person who likes to lean into those awkward moments. So, and just see how far you can go.
Yeah, you're no stranger to walking right into awkward moments. I've seen that in a couple of different roles that you've had.
Yeah.
What do you do when one of your jokes just falls flat, Ryan? How do you navigate that? I guess is the best question I could ask.
I mean, immediately you just got to poke at yourself. I mean, it goes right back at you because you didn't read the room correctly, or someone may have been offended, and that's what you don't want to do is offend someone, but we all do that, and we don't mean to. But depending on the joke itself, and as I said, I've told many jokes where I appear to be the ass of the joke because no one did laugh, and when I say joke, a comment that was made, that's when you just, depending on the situation, is too soon,
right?
And that's especially if it's someone who's sensitive about it. But the other, it's just you don't walk back from it; you just own it.
Yeah. No, that's a good piece of advice, I think. You and I have talked in the past about a characteristic, and this is a personality thing, called woo.
Yeah.
I think not everyone has woo, but if you have it, that's a strength you can lean into.
Correct.
So talk about woo and what that means to you.
And you have to be cognizant of being a woo as well, winning others over, because there are times where your personality may be overwhelming to other people, because most woos, I would say, and I don't know this scientifically, so I can't say that research quantifies this, but the woo itself is probably most individuals are extroverts. And so I could tell you, as of recently, we have a board of education member who is by all means very much an introvert. And a woo can drain that person really quickly if they're around them very long. But to leverage that as a strength within the organization is of extreme importance, because there are people who, I think would love to be a woo, to be the person who likes not necessarily to be the center of attention, but is comfortable with having a microphone, or is comfortable networking and getting out in front of people. The woos have this tendency to really build a strong culture and energize and galvanize a team, but we do that externally as well, where people want to be part of that conversation and they want to dig a little deeper within what you're doing.
Yeah, the woo, or you said winning others over, which is a great description of that. In this day and age, we talk a lot about influencers.
Right.
You can't go to any website without having influencers, right? So how do you see that working in terms of leadership? And I know humor can be attached to that, but not necessarily.
I would argue with my strength of having woo, part of that I think just comes from how the family I was raised in. We always joke that we were the loud family, because if you weren't loud, you weren't heard. But as it relates specifically with influencing others, I actually think that starts more with you being intentional in the relationships you're trying to build. And even if you're bringing on let's just say a new client or establishing a new partnership, the woo, or anybody, you don't have to have the woo strength to do this, but it's really to get out in front and to do the research of who the organization is, and to look at aligning values, and then taking those values and bringing that sense of energy that a woo would have in establishing stronger relationships.
Okay. And, that's a kind of a precursor to some types of humor that someone who has that as a strength would use.
Right.
But do you think that you can cross a line at work with humor?
Oh, by all means.
Yeah.
Yeah. That happens all the time.
People have lost jobs over
People
that.
have lost jobs. And that's you being tactful in your humor, being appropriate in your humor, and knowing your audience. And, there's humor that you have with your friends and family that may not be appropriate for the workplace. And, there's humor that you have in the workplace that is unique to the culture of the work that you have, that if you told that joke or that situation at home, I mean, we've all done this with our spouses and partners, et cetera, and they look at you and like, well, that's not that funny. We're like, well, at work, it was hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah, the context does matter.
Always goes back to it.
It does matter a lot. One of the sets of authors I like in leadership is Bowman and Deal.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about the 4 quadrants of leadership. And one of those quadrants, and the most powerful, is symbolic leadership. And so as a leader, when you're using humor, talk to us for a second about how you think that's symbolic, because everything you do as a leader is scrutinized.
Right. Well, when I think of symbolic leadership, I tend to focus on rituals of an organization, those values that are brought in, but really the storytelling. And for me to be part of an organization or to feel like I belong, context, or is it content or context in Strength Finders? I think it's context, where it's about the history of the organization. And so those stories of how an organization started, or tough decisions and how those were made to get us to where we are now, to me, that is of great importance. And usually when that transpires and you're talking about the past, there's always, within these stories, even though there might be struggles and hardships, there's always this sense of humor that's added within it. Just because at the end of the day, we're human and we work through this together. And so I always think of one of my former board members who, yes, we would have meetings that would go well into the early hours because he loved to tell a long story and had a lot of institutional knowledge, not only of the school district, but also that of the community as a whole. But there was such a richness of those stories that he shared because his family's been within the community for so long. But it painted a picture of where we were and because of that, where we need to go. And I always thought those stories had, those little elements of humility, because as humans, none of us were perfect. Decisions weren't always the best made. I think, one of the board members who always talked about the mistake that he made the first time he was on the board, and, he's our famous plumber.
Right.
But when he talked about, they made this decision to acquire all of these boilers all in the same year. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens 30 years down the road? All those boilers come down. And he talked about what an ass he was in making that decision and reflecting on, like, why did we do it this way? But to me, that was such a richness and this element of vulnerability that he shared that actually elevated every single board member and even staff members in that room. Like, we need to, as leaders, think of our decisions and how they're going to impact the long game as well.
Yeah. One movie that was very famous was called The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, right? And I think that's a lesson for any leader, because if you are reflective, and you should be, and you look back, you can always think of things you probably would do differently the second go round. Part of that symbolic piece I was thinking about when it comes to humor is whatever you say, it just carries such a different weight than when you were just colleague to colleague with someone. So as you've stepped into different roles, you keep thinking, I'm sure, like all of us, human nature, I'm still the same person. But sometimes the weight of those words carries a different meaning for people who now see you as their boss. Or something like that. And so I just wondered how you use that in terms of that supervisory way now, and symbolically knowing that carries a different weight.
Well, and just in speaking of that, I think, as we look at symbolic leadership, the use of humor to influence, I do think that there's some red flags that we have to consider as well. Sometimes in using humor too much is you're not necessarily taken seriously. And as a leader, you gotta be aware of that. But also, I've always focused on my teams as we're family oriented. I truly believe that. And I know the Harvard Business Review would disagree with me in this thinking, but I'm not going to abandon that. It's worked and it's been effective for me. However, when you use humor frequently and you engage your staff in a way where, banter's encouraged amongst each other, as long as it's tactful, people can take advantage of your kindness. And that's something that we have to be aware of when we are engaging in, playful humor within the workplace. those are red flags that you have to be aware of, and you have to know when to call it out too. So when that staff member does take advantage of you, as a leader, you need to forthright and have those conversations and be frank and know that that they're taking advantage of one's kindness.
Yeah. I would often talk to my team about what you say and what you choose not to say are equally important. Where you go and where you choose not to go are equally important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that to go along with what you were just speaking about, if you use humor inappropriately, sometimes that can make someone feel like the issue they brought to you isn't really that important.
Correct.
If you're not careful. I think that's where your train of thought was going with that.
Well, it's part of that. And, the other thing as a leader, the one thing, that we're always trying to establish and build more of is credibility, whether that's internally or externally. And so you have to be very tactful in your approach and what you say, how you say it, and your actions as well, what you do.
Yeah. So people talk a lot about EQ, that emotional piece, that emotional intelligence piece. How do you think that weaves into use of humor?
It's your ability to read the room and know people. I think the most significant aspect of emotional intelligence is your ability not only just to read the room, but strong leaders can adapt to their other person's communication style. So when I'm interacting with individuals where I see my strength, and maybe this is part of that woo that comes out as well, is my strength is that ability, because everyone has different preferences of how they want to communicate, how they do communicate. There's cultural cues, intercultural aspects that are at play within this, and being able to recognize who you're interacting with and their style is probably of utmost importance as a leader of being effective and moving forward.
That's a good point. I think that having a sense of humor too, when people, if you're willing to dish it out, you got to be able to take it, right?
100%.
But I think when you're willing to do that, that makes you more approachable sometimes as a leader. At least that's my feeling. My type of humor in sitting in meetings a lot of times is that, or to cut through whatever was happening, is I have a tendency as an extrovert to think outside of my body.
Right.
And so sometimes I just say what I'm thinking, and I think sometimes that's the best, the most natural kind of humor you can have, because I think you can look at somebody and say, so what's that look about? What did I just say? Do I have something on my face? Or,
right.
And just cut through it to put people at ease.
Right.
Maybe.
When it's authentic, when you do that as well. And people, I think, recognize that on the other side of the table that, okay, this person's genuine. It was, not everyone's quick-witted either, but I do think as leaders, sometimes, we have those moments, but I do think it adds to one's credibility down the road as well.
Yeah. I think how you laugh at yourself as a leader can either make or break a situation too. So when you were talking about, you spilled the wine, on the superintendent, if she had taken that too seriously, that whole room would have been, I'm sure, just like crawling under the carpet or something. But she didn't.
No, she did not.
When you can laugh at yourself, that's
right.
The best form of, I think, using humor.
Well, and it showed, as a leader, when you do laugh at yourself, it just goes back, you're just like everybody else. We're human. We're going to make mistakes.
That's right.
We have our own vulnerabilities. And, that I think people resonate with that.
Yeah. They can probably see themselves in it.
100%.
Would be my guess. So you're a dad to a high schooler and a middle schooler.
Yeah.
All right. How do you use humor with them? And what do they think of your dad humor?
I don't do a lot of dad jokes per se. However, one thing I would argue that I've trained my children in is
or have they trained you?
Well, probably a little bit of both. You're right. I want them to be quick-witted. I want them to understand sarcasm. And I've always heard from their teachers, which is one of the things I do love and this was early on in their primary grade. So first, second, their teachers would always like, your kids are some of my favorite, not because they're excellent students, by any means. They're McCoys. No, they. But the reality is the teachers would have dry humor, or they would have jokes, and my children, both of them, would catch on to those jokes, and they would add their humor to it. But within, I work in a building where my daughter goes to high school. And I know at first, I think she was horrified that we would be in the same building and that we'd cross paths. But shortly within probably the first month of her being in the high school, she realized that my dad is a pretty funny guy. My friends appreciate my dad. And my friends look for my dad when we're in the hallways and we're crossing through. And so I think there's that aspect.
It's a different perspective.
A completely different perspective. And now she looks for me when we're in the halls walking, and then she's not just asking for money, but she's actually, she wants to see what dad's doing.
But that's a bonus.
It is a bonus always with dad. But now she just, she texts me usually and it just says dad, and there's nothing else there. That's all it says. I'm like, well, what do you need?
Yeah. So, I just wonder how your kids feel. They've seen you as a school board member. Mm-hmm. They've seen you work at the community college. They see you now working in their bubble, in their ecosystem. What do you think that's modeled for them, Ryan?
At the end of the day, I hope that they see that, that work ethic matters, that community matters, that, you have to engage yourself. You have to take on challenges. And I think they see that, and that they know that they themselves have to work hard, that there's an expectation. And I'm not one to be afraid to, and my children know this, that, I set high expectations for people, and that's okay. And I expect all people around me to thrive. And if they're not thriving, I look at myself like, what do I need to do to ensure that you can elevate?
You set high expectations for you too.
Right. Oh, immensely, even more probably than the individuals that I surround myself with. But right. I think my kids see that, and they know that they have to get engaged, and where the way their actions show me that they see the work that I'm doing and how I get involved, because my daughter is in leadership committees with the city, as well as going to leadership conferences. My son who's younger, is now starting to get engaged in that work, and is actually looking at different pathways as far as, do I want to get involved in politics? Do I want to be an attorney? And when he tells me he wants to be an attorney, I'm like, well, which kind of attorney? And he says environmental law. And I'm like, do you really? No, I'm just joking. But the reality is, you lead by example. And actions, as we all know, speak louder than words.
So symbolic leadership.
But there's the 6 languages of love, I think, and the 6 languages of appreciation, or something at work. And the most important one to me is quality of time. And so I do make sure I carve out time for my children one-on-one, so that we go and have moments together, so that we can talk through things. And the one thing that I think has shocked most people is my daughter and I have a very open relationship in regards to open communication. So things that she shares with me, probably most daughters don't share with their dads, or even their moms.
You don't want them to share with dad.
No, and that's the truth of it as well.
As she gets closer to college, you're going to find that out.
100%. But that's, I think, but we take that time with one another. But I would say within that, they, by all means, we come from like I said, we're a loud family, and humor and banter is very much a part of our culture within our family. And both of my children know how to take it and deliver it quite well.
Well, and it probably takes some pressure off them too.
100%.
I would think, in their daily social interactions, they've had that model for them pretty well.
Well, and I know their moments of pride when bantering back and forth with dad is when dad doesn't have a comeback. That's a moment that they all celebrate. Like, so if my son does it to me and the daughter's in the room, she'll just start clapping like, "Oh, you got him." And so, but that's just part of the relationships that we have.
Yeah. And the dynamics. Yeah, absolutely. All right. So advice for leaders who might need to loosen up a little bit. What advice would you have? This whole podcast is about sense of humor. And hopefully we have some people who are aspiring leaders listening or watching. And hopefully we have some leaders who are in current positions thinking about their next challenge or their next level.
So one thing that we were always told just growing up, my brothers and I, you can never take yourself too seriously, your job too seriously, because at the end of the day, we don't get out of this world alive. And we already alluded to that at the very beginning. And part of that, and the reason that was always communicated to us, is because we were told that you are the only individual who could bring fun into the environment. Meaning that it has to start with you. You have to let yourself be willingly to be open up and to have fun. For those who struggle with that, I think it's difficult to try to have that conversation with some of those individuals because there's a reason why they're so serious. And so if you are a person who tends to have more fun and enjoys humor, but you're working with someone who's not that way, I would try to figure out the reasons why they put that guard up, figure out the reasons why they want to be seen as serious or are so serious, because I think you have to understand that person to break that down for them, for that to happen.
Yeah, I was mentioning to, it's a good point. I was mentioning to somebody earlier that I think one of the biggest mistakes that first-year leaders encounter is they're so afraid of failing.
Completely.
And they don't want to mess it up, that they hang on to control too much. And the exact opposite happens because no one on the team wants to feel like they're being stifled.
Right.
And even with the agenda of just not wanting to mess up, which is a good agenda to have, it still gets in the way sometimes. So if I had any advice for first-year leaders, it would be try to loosen up in that way a little bit, because at the end of everything, we all have personal accountability, but you got to be able to work on a team, to trust your team, to be able to get the job done, because none of us do it alone.
No. And I like the way you said it. So ditto. What you just said is what I wanted to articulate.
Well, I don't know.
Well.
I'd have to replay it back and remember what I just said to laminate it. But one last thing to cover with you today, Ryan, is you've done well in your career. You keep holding yourself to a high standard and moving from where you can make the biggest impact to the next, where can I make the next biggest impact? So 5 years from now, what are you going to be doing?
I mean, my life's mission and purpose is to advance the lives of others. And I do that through engaging philanthropists, establishing partnerships, and creating opportunities for people to thrive and succeed, and so that they can see it within themselves as well. That's
because somebody did that for you.
Right. And that's where, regardless of where I am, that's what I will be doing. And, I also, in the words of Tom Petty, you never slow down, you never grow old. And that's my mantra. And so we have to keep thriving forward, and we need to keep galvanizing people, because it's going to be difficult. And especially in this landscape of public education that's always being scrutinized, we're going to need champions, and we're going to need to rally people around our work to ensure that we are putting that next class forward so that they're successful. Because if they're successful, then that means the class behind them will continue on, and it just ripples down that way.
That's the legacy.
That's the legacy.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned lifting people up. I want to thank you for being here today and lifting us up. The whole purpose of the Entrusted podcast is to lift aspiring and current leaders up, and just have a moment in a day where you can get inspired or think about something different to hone your own skill set. So I appreciate you being with us.
Well, I appreciate you allowing me to be here and not doing this during the Bronco game.
And I want to thank everyone who's been listening or watching today on the Entrusted podcast. I hope having this little bit of humor in your day has helped you think about not taking yourself too seriously, but knowing that we do serious work. So all of us are issued just a certain number of heartbeats. And I just appreciate all of you who've spent some of those heartbeats with us today. And as I always told my team at the end of a meeting, No matter if it was serious, short, long, funny, not funny, rock on with your bad selves.